we have Andrew Harkness and Joel Nodelman. So Andrew is a principal of the firm, Morrison Hershfield, vice president and climate change practice lead at Morrison Hershfield. He's got over 30 years of infrastructure planning and design experience and is a project management professional. And joining Andrew is Joel Nodelman, who many of you know. Joel Nodelman is an engineering and risk management specialist with over 40 years of professional practice. He's been involved in the PIEVC program since the very beginning and has provided his expertise for many PIEVC products and resources, including the high-level screening guide. And you may have seen him present last time as well. So with that, we'll pass it over to Andrew and Joel.
Well, good morning, everyone. Nice to be with you all today. And thank you for the invitation to be with you to be able to present on our climate risk and vulnerability assessment work that we recently completed for Brookfield Global Integrated Solutions, or BGIS, on behalf of Public Works and Government Services Canada. At our client's request, we're keeping the presentation at a relatively high level, but we're happy to share an overview of the project, the process we followed, as well as some of the key outcomes and lessons learned. Our introductions have been given already by Dan, so I think we can move on to the next slide. Just an overview of our presentation. I'll lead off with just a little overview of the assignment, two actually that we undertook for BGIS, and then we'll hand over to Joel, who will walk us through the scope definition, data gathering, and risk assessment steps of the risk assessment process. And then I'll wrap up with some of the findings, key outcomes, and lessons learned. Next slide, please. So just an overview of the project. Morrison Hershfield with Nodelcorp assessed multiple existing federal government building projects and sites following an approach consistent with Infrastructure Canada's Climate Lens guidance, ISO 31000 risk management standard, and following the PIEVC protocol high-level screening guide. A total of 9 sites were assessed, all in the National Capital Region. Typical building uses included office space, some retail. One included museum storage. Some of the space was rented out to other users for education purposes, and there were some other uses as well. So quite an interesting mix of uses of the building sites. They've all been around for quite some time. Typical adjacent land uses mostly were in urban context, but 2 of them were in or near to a large forested green space on the Gatineau side of the National Capital Region. Next slide, please. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joel. Just need to unmute.
Yeah, I'm trying to find my unmute button.
Very good.
Okay, so I'm going to very quickly go through the steps we followed. Now, these are basically, all of this work followed the high-level screening guide. So I'm not going to go into detail on each step in the way that Jeff would have, but I'm more interested in how we applied all of that to this portfolio of buildings and how the team structured the work to get consistent results. So we did follow the high-level screening guide. We were concerned about common features across the whole portfolio, so we considered that in the way we defined the scope. We defined a standard set of climate and infrastructure parameters that we worked with as a starting point. And as we went into each specific assessment, we would tweak that to be more representative of the specific site. But it started with a consistent, almost like a standard set that we would work with, much like the work that we're talking about in BC. It's a standard set we start, and then we kind of tweak it out based on the site. So we defined the scope that way that the client actually defined the buildings we're going to be looking at. And then a lot of our discussion in the scoping stage was how far out do we take this in terms of interactions with third parties, with people who are accessing the site, with neighbors, those sorts of things. So that was considered in the work that we were doing. We went to gather data. I think the important thing about this and the tweak that we made is that there was a site visit for each piece of the work. and also we drew data from recognized sources. So for the climate data, we drew from the Climate Atlas, climatedata.ca, but it was then filtered through the technical team at Morrison Hershfield to make sure that the data was robust and adequate for the purpose of each assessment. So we would draw from and then adjust the data as appropriate. As it was a portfolio, we were trying to keep the climate parameters relatively consistent across the board so that we could have cross comparison between all of the buildings that we were looking at. But some of those core parameters needed to be adjusted just a little bit as we went along. We included in, for example, in climate, invasive species, which not really a climate parameter, but we did consider that, and then we adjusted that because urban environments have different aspects of that than, say, some of the things that were in a more rural setting. So because we were doing this as a portfolio, we were very conscious that we needed to strive for consistency. So there was a lot of work in trying to keep things relatively consistent. So I'm on step 2, gather data. Sorry, I didn't tell you that. There we go. And next one, please. Okay. With the building data, we define once again a clear set of standard building elements that we would take a look at. But once again, each set of elements was adjusted to match the nuances of each building. So standard set, tweaked, and then we were able to get some consistency across the board. In this part of the work, the key thing was that the site visits. Each site was visited by the technical team from Morrison Hershfield. Extensive sets of photographs were taken, and we also developed a guide that the site visitors would take with them. So it was like a checklist. Here are the questions you need to ask. Here are the things you need to look at, so that when we got into the actual risk assessment, we had a bunch of data that we needed to look at. So we could always look at a picture of something. We could always look at the checklist to see what answers to the questions were, and that really informed our ability to streamline the actual risk assessment process. Next slide, please. Yes, so the risk assessment followed our standard approach, exposure times likelihood times consequence. We did a workshop for each site. The attendees of the workshop included the technical team from Morrison Hershfield, who did the site visits, as well as us folks from Nodelcorp in terms of risk analysis, and also representatives from the client in terms of their management, and most importantly, people who were actually working the buildings. So they're the people who managed the buildings directly, who did maintenance on the buildings directly. So that was the assessment team. All of this was done via web-based meetings. And we really found that the site visits and the attendance from the client at these meetings really informed and helped us get to some robust results. We did use the middle baseline approach of the high-level screening guide. We did have to tweak that a couple of times because one of the nuances of that approach is that for special cases like extreme events, we were finding it was tending to overstate the risk. So it was tending to drive to action on, say, a tornado event, which may occur very, very, very infrequently. So we did tweak those specific parameters on a case-by-case basis to be a more traditional 5-point scale based on the old PIEVC approach. And the results from the workshop were then compiled. We used the standard high-level screening guide and climate lens parameters to define what is a high-level, high-risk, medium risk, low risk. And so we did that, and that was, I think the important part of this project for me was that this is typically where a PIEVC assessment would leave off. But I think what Andrew is about to take over from and explain is what we did as a project next, because I think the adaptation measures, the risk treatments are a very important part of this work. We always do climate assessment for a purpose, and the purpose is to get to the risk treatment. What are the actions we need to take? And with that, I'm going to turn it back to just one more slide. I have to talk about reporting. It's just, basically I said this, we have to consider the findings from each step. What I think an important part of the reporting was that there was a detailed peer review through the team. So the entire team, all the technical, all the risk folks, everybody reviewed the findings to make sure that they were robust from the perspective of their particular lens, so that we were coming out with a consistent set of recommendations. And I think that was an important element of this that is often not stated in our guidance. So Andrew, you can take it from here.
Very good. Thanks, Joel. So next slide, please. As Joel said, risk profiles were unique to each site, but typical risks seen throughout the project resulted from parameters such as extreme heat, increased precipitation, and for one or two sites that are in or near a forested green space, setting potential wildfire impacts. Mitigation strategies were created for each site and included upgrades, for example, to building envelope and building heating and cooling systems, site management plans, and/or operational policy changes. Next slide, please. So assessment mitigation recommendations included a variety of things, including responses to extreme heat, upgrades to wall insulation and windows, transition to LED lighting, upgrades to cooling plants, and in the one or two cases, potential responses to wildfires, such as smoke management plans, upgrades to on-site fire prevention measures. Additional examples include upgrades to on-site drainage systems to deal with increased precipitation, development of utility power outage, management plans in case extreme weather disrupted power supply, and policy-related strategies such as relaxed dress codes for workers for more comfortable working conditions in conditions of increased temperatures. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about the more about the reporting, and then we'll wrap up. We did consider various planning horizons in conjunction with the climate projections, considering the age of the building, the sort of typical life cycle of the building, what age it was at, and sort of renewal and upgrade cycle. The strategies were based on that. Budget classifications were also established across the portfolio of projects when identifying recommendations as well, considering both capital and operating expenses varying from low to high. So for example, capital expenses at the low end, things that might fall under $100,000. So not insignificant, but that was the threshold for low, varying up to the high level over $5 million in terms of upgrades. Operating expenses had a much tighter band. Low was under $5,000 annually, whereas high was over $25,000. And just turning to our last slide, please. So just key takeaways from our team's experience on this and other similar projects that I'd like to just leave with you for portfolio assessments, such as the work we did for BGIS. It was really beneficial to start with a pilot phase, confirm the process, the stakeholders and deliverable formats, and then replicate and scale up. I think you're hearing from everyone today that collaboration is key. For these more involved projects, very, very important to build a diverse team, engage with the facility owners and operators, ask lots of questions, dig for the historic info and insights. And just thinking more broadly as an agent of change within each of our organizations, so important to be communicating the importance and the value, i.e. the business case of considering the effects of a changing climate on infrastructure, operations, services, and people. We need to invest in expanding our organization's capabilities and expertise, continue to engage through sessions such as this with our other specialists and practitioners for input, guidance, and to share knowledge and lessons learned. And finally, just to embed a climate change focus across all that we do. Thank you very much for your time and interest today.